Hello everybody, this is the video for 6.1, Objective 3. We're going to be looking at finding the GCF from a polynomial. Polynomials are those multi-term expressions that we've been looking at for the last few weeks.
Let's now practice factoring out the greatest common factor of a polynomial. Here I have the binomial 30x minus 15. I'd like to factor this polynomial or binomial, and the first step is to factor out the greatest common factor. I have 30x and I have 15. What about the numerical coefficient 30 and the number 15? What is the greatest common factor of those two integers? The greatest common factor there is 15 because 15 is also a factor of 30. And then there is no variable common factor because 15 is simply a number and there's no variable there unless you want to call it raised to a power of 0, but we won't go into that. So let's factor out the greatest common factor of these two terms, which is 15. Do you agree that I can write this as 15 times 2x minus 15 times 1? 15 times 2x, that is 30x, and then 15 times 1 is 15. Then we simply use the distributive property to factor out that common factor of 15. That's 15 times then 2x minus 1. I factored out the greatest common factor of 15. You can check by multiplying. Multiply and you'll get the original binomial. Also, notice that the binomial left, 2x minus 1, has no greatest common factor other than 1 or negative 1. So I've correctly factored out the greatest common factor. Let's continue working on this. Let's suppose I have, say, the trinomial 14x cubed y plus 7x squared y minus 7xy. There is my trinomial. I'd like to factor this trinomial. To factor, we first look for the greatest common factor. Let's look for the greatest common factor of these three terms. What about the numerical coefficients? 14, 7, and 7, or negative 7, however you want to think of that. That greatest common factor is 7. Now let's check out the variables separately. I've got x cubed, x squared, and x to an understood power of 1. Remember, the greatest common factor will then be x raised to the smallest exponent. We've got 3, 2, 1. The smallest exponent is 1. So I'll just leave that as x. That's an understood x to the 1. And then let's look at the y's. I have y or y to the 1, y again or y to the 1, y again or y to the 1. Just dealing with the variable y, what is that greatest common factor? It is y to the 1 or y. So of these three terms, here is my greatest common factor. Now let's see if we can go ahead and factor that out. When you're factoring out a greatest common factor, it's like taking each of these terms and dividing by that greatest common factor. Or if you prefer, you can think of multiplication. In other words, 7 times what gives me 14? Well, that's 2. X times what gives me x cubed? Well, that's x squared. And y times what gives me y? Well, that's 1. But that's okay, I don't need to write the 1 there because 1 times 2 is simply 2. Plus, again, think of it this way as what you need to multiply by to get this, or you can think of this divided by this is what? Whichever way makes you more comfortable. Think of it as division for a moment. What is this divided by this? Well, the 7's divide out, the y's divide out, and x squared divided by x is x. Double check, isn't this times this 7x squared y? Yes. Minus this times what gives me this? Well, that would be 1. And do not forget that 1. If you started with a trinomial and you're factoring out a greatest common factor, what's left should be a trinomial, that same polynomial, or the same number of terms, excuse me. Now, how do you check? Check by multiplying. Always check when you're factoring. Check by multiplying. Also, see if the trinomial, in this case left, has any other greatest common factors other than 1 or negative 1. The answer here is no, so I have factored this trinomial, and I factored it by factoring out the greatest common factor. Remember what factor means? Factor means write as a product.
Oh no, what happened? Slow internets or what?
And I have done so. I've written as a product. Let's suppose I want to take this polynomial.
Oh my goodness. Sorry guys, I guess my Wi-Fi or my internet's slow right now. It's using up a lot of bandwidth.
And factor. Factor again means write as a product. The first step in factoring is to factor out a greatest common factor. You might want to think of this as two terms. Can you see a common factor in these two terms?
In other words, what's in
The
common
answer
in
is
both?
yes. The common factor is that binomial x squared plus 2. So I'm factoring it out of each of these two terms, x squared plus 2. If I factor this from this term, I'm left with y plus, if I factor this from, I'll call this a term, this, I'm left with 3. Now, how can you check? Once again, check by multiplying. This times this, that gives me that, and this times this, that gives me this. Now, sometimes some students are bothered by the fact that they see 2x squared plus 2's, and I just write it once here, but remember, it's a common factor that I'm factoring it out. So the common factor is simply x squared plus 2, and that's what I've factored out. So now we know how to factor out a greatest common factor.
All right, that's it guys for this section. We got one more video for this handout and then we'll be all set for today.